net zero emissions by 2050. Are you excited?
Back in the house of hostilities, apparently. Look, what's going to happen in 2050? I'll tell you one thing for certain. None of us in this building are going to be here. Quite a large portion will have passed away. You'll be a grandmother with a number of grandkids. That's the only thing that's certain about 2050. It's a long way off. Always we look at the path. The reason in the past we met our Kyoto protocols or Kyoto targets is because of the theft of vegetation rights of farmers without compensation. And it was done by the states, so they didn't have to compensate. And I remember watching the 7:30 report where my jaw almost hit the ground as Peter Costello admitted that they'd contrived a process, a plan to do that. Now, that means in regional areas we're very much focused on who actually pays for this pathway. If you want to talk about bringing in nuclear power, sure, knock yourself out, that's great. That would be a large leap out of the 1980s. If you're talking about doing what Japan does and replacing your coal-fired power stations with a new version, high-intensity, low-emission coal-fired power stations to reduce your carbon emissions, I'm sure would be on board with that. But if you're saying, well, we're going to do it by reducing methane emissions from animals and putting a target on how many cattle you have, by basically taking the power prices even higher, by putting further caveats on people's lives, by shutting down further manufacturing, then no,
okay,
we're not on board.
So what's your view? Can it be done? And are you saying it can only be done with new, more efficient coal-fired power stations and perhaps nuclear power?
Well, I'm saying that you have to have a pathway, and if you want zero emissions, nuclear power does it. We now have new energy in the United States have basically off-the-shelf pebble-bed reactors. It's, you know, the technology is miles ahead of Chernobyl, which is 1950s technology. It's safer than Fukushima. By the way, no one died at Fukushima. You know, we should, you know, get with the program. But if you're going to make a big statement, you've got to have a big policy agenda behind it and how you do it. And of course, that is where the rubber hits the road, because that is where we look at how the people in our electorate, the poorer people, are going to manage the costs if those costs are lumbered on them. If to create a simile, if we were to come up with a policy and then said that all cities will return to 2005 populations, I bet you there'd be a lot of people in Sydney saying, by 2050, there'd be a lot of people in Sydney saying, that's interesting, how do you intend to do that?
Well, that's just the point, isn't it? The Prime Minister yesterday said that he doesn't know how you would get to net zero emissions by 2050, but he said that he doesn't want to rely on the bush to do that. Was this discussed with the Nationals at any level before this, I guess, semi-announcement yesterday?
Well, not the conversation that I was privy to. There are obviously, I'm at the bottom of the ladder, so I wouldn't expect to hear that conversation. But ultimately, all this comes down to legislation that has to go through Parliament, and that's where the discussions would be. I'll go back, reiterate what I said at the start. In 2050, we're not going to be here. I won't be voting on it. I'd be in my 80s. Maybe that would. Maybe if you watch US presidents, that's possible. And you won't be commentating on it, and there'll be people we've never met before in our lives who'll be in this building.
I think you might be selling us both short there, but anyway, you're back in Canberra now. You've been in your electorate. There's good news on the vaccine front, and it seems that Australians are mostly getting on board there. Is that your view, that, you know, there's not as many anti-vaxxers out there as we think?
Well, I think that people have to have the liberty to say no. If you force it on people, then you'll have a different argument. But I think overwhelmingly people are going to participate in the program, and I think Australia's to be commended. And you know, the actions of the Prime Minister and the dare I say it, the state premiers to an extent, they've gone over the top in some areas. But this has meant that Australia has a very solid base. So you know, the precedence of trying to get a vaccine out is not as pressing as it would be in the United States or England, where obviously fatalities are outrageously high.
How do you think the state premiers have gone over the top?
Well, locking down borders, this sort of arbitrary locking down, opening up, locking down, opening up, not following the epidemiological logic of saying, well, if the virus is not in North Queensland and it's not in northern New South Wales, and northern New South Wales should be able to travel to North Queensland, where lies the problem? But when you just have this sort of parochial, colonial line on a map and say, we now have this almost divine process that you cannot cross this arbitrary line. It just doesn't stack up to logic. And what's happening now is you've got Anastasia Palaszczuk screaming and saying she wants more money because it's doing it tough. Well, she did it to herself.
And just finally, how helpful is Craig Kelly's advice on all of this?
Well, Craig's allowed to say what Craig wants, and the people of the electorate of Hughes have the capacity to, it's their judgment, not ours. And I agree with something the Prime Minister said. Craig is not a doctor. And if you're going to take medical advice from Craig, well, you might as well take it from me, brush your teeth with a black toothbrush. It works better, Why?
What is your advice on the vaccine?
Well, I would suggest that you try and reduce your risk as much as possible, and you be very considerate of the other people that you work with. And so that I would suggest strongly that you take, that just like measles or mumps or polio, that you get vaccinated, but it's your choice. But if you get these, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, no vaxxer, but I like the idea that it's not demanded of me, but I do it out of free will and logic.
OK, well, just very quickly and finally, you asked for the Nats to get more senior portfolios in the lead up to the election. When do you think the election would be, and how did that call go down?
Well, look, I acknowledge I'm the bad cop, and that's not how you make friends. Certainly, people say you're touting for leadership. Definitely not. That's not how you do it. You'd be a jolly good fellow if you want to do that job. I'm trying to make sure that the party I fought to maintain back in around about 2007 continues on, and it's got to, for the sake of the coalition, you've got to make sure you have a proper spread of resources, a proper spread of senior portfolios, and that the optics of it in question time is proper and really shows a coalition. And these things need to be said, because once you ventilate them by default, you throw down the gauntlet and say, well, OK, let's make sure that this is a fair appropriation of resources, committees, portfolios, optics. We want to see that.